McMahon.
No. You can tell him to go kiss off, but I've been here all night, and I ain't leaving yet. And you can stop counting me down, because I done told you once, son. We got a damn problem.
Hey, wait a minute.
No more. That ain't gonna work.
Where's the production assistant?
No, we ain't through that by a long shot. You don't count me down.
What is this?
Nobody counts me down. You want your precious minors? You think it's all fun and games for Stone Cold? It ain't fun and games for somebody long shot.
All right, folks, I want to thank you for hitting the download here on part 2 of my interview with the great Mike Mooneyham here on Under Duress, Off the Grid. We had a lot of fun last week getting into various topics in regards to the evolution of professional wrestling as a business, as we also said, a literary form as well, the journalism behind it. This week, we're going to expound upon a couple of those things a little bit further. Most notably, I would say, is when we start talking about pro wrestling books, like the biographies that have come out, the other publications. What are some of the more fun reads that are out there? We also get into a little bit more having to do with sort of the repercussions, what came out of Sex, Lies, and Headlocks for Mike Mooneyham and his relationship with the WWE and Vince McMahon. And last but not least is what I find the most interesting is talking about what would the definitive Ric Flair biography be like if it was written by Mike Mooneyham. We know about the one that came out, the one that the WWE was backing, the one to be the man, as it was called, and how it was received. And the way it was received was honestly not so well. And that's why it seems like it leaves a door open for a proper rendition to be done down the road. That's something that we talk about today. So without much further ado, once again, Under Duress, Off the Grid. Like Under Duress, the main show is a part of the 4CR Wrestling Network. Please go to our website. Go to 4crwrestling.com. Read some of the articles that are up there. Also, check out the other podcasts that we have available as well through Spreaker, through iTunes. There are a lot of ways to be able to listen to the show, and there are a lot of shows out there. So, take some free time, go check it out. We got a lot of different things for you to listen to. But without further ado, let's get into it. This is part 2 of my interview with Mike Mooneyham.
Did an interview like that once with Bill Goldberg when he was fairly new.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, the tape didn't work. And I couldn't exactly, I felt it was unfair to even try to quote him,
Right.
in print, because it just, I couldn't back it up. I knew what he said. But unfortunately, it was probably the most revealing interview he ever did. And it was only because he was still sort of new and he didn't know what to say and what not to say.
Yeah.
But, oh my God, you should. And I couldn't use it. I wasn't going to call him back and say, hey, I want you to repeat everything, like then he would know something was up. So, but man, he said stuff that if WCW had known he said, they would have said, we can't let you do any more interviews. Because he was talking about Hogan.
Right.
And he was saying, yeah, all that brother crap he tells you can't believe anything that guy says.
Well, and that's what's neat about him now. I just heard him on Colt Cabana's show. Just heard him doing that podcast. And it was funny. What's funny about his evolution is it's a guy who wasn't that enthralled with wrestling who became massive in it. And that's what was interesting hearing him talk about it and stuff. And, it seems like, well, and I guess this is a combination of, I think, some Bischoff stories and other people. It's like, once he blew up, and sometimes, your ego changes and it grows, and that's kind of to be expected, because now you are the pinnacle of the mountain, especially for a company that was, unfortunately on the way out and everything. But it's still a fascinating listen though when you hear him, you hear him interview nowadays, because I guess you could essentially say he was the last like homegrown WCW talent that made it. I guess you could say, yeah. You were talking about the magazines a little bit. Just kind of, I guess, quickly go back into it about the evolution of wrestling. It's wrestling journalism. From the magazines, we're into the internet now. We have the after mags. There's the newsletters. Like, I guess, kind of. It's such a big mountain to climb there with it. But what's the bridge that you see, of the wrestling evolution of journalism and stuff?
Well, certainly it all changed when with the advent of the internet. That changed everything. Instead of waiting for a monthly magazine or even a weekly newsletter, you got everything instantaneously. No longer were you able to do things 3 weeks, 4 weeks in advance. I mean, everything happened that minute. So, that's why the magazines started becoming extinct. And that's when everything was on the internet. You had podcasts. There's so many good podcasts out there right now. And you just can't get, people can't get enough of wrestling information, which certainly is different than when I came up. You had to read a wrestling magazine to find out what was happening in professional wrestling, and that you could be a month or two behind there. So it's changed the whole game, and it's changing that dynamic of the business, and the wrestling promoters have to acknowledge that now and work accordingly.
Well, and you and I had talked about, like, obviously the veil of kayfabe and the exposure of the business has become greater, over the years, to the point now where everybody knows, we've been taken behind the curtain of the all magical Oz. We know how it works and everything. And the thing is, like, and that's why there's always going to be that ridicule over the product, especially since UFC exists now, and that's and that is what it is, and that's fine. But I'm always more into that theatricality. What I think is funny is, like, you watch behind the scenes featurettes of movies. You see how the director frames a shot. What's so different than about this over here? It's wrestling. It's essentially a film. It's a movie. It's a TV show. It's a book. It's all those things that are, hey, folks, fiction, but it's living, breathing in front of your eyes. So what is, that's why I never understood why, there was always that, you like the fake stuff. And then that's when you're immediately disregarded in conversation.
Yes. And fortunately, that's becoming more and more extinct, too. You don't see as much of that as, it's just fake. We know it's predetermined. It's the story. Right. It's a story in everything. It's a story in a movie. It's a story in a book. It's a story in a soap opera. It's a story in professional wrestling. And if you can tell it well, it's good and it's entertaining. If you can tell that story well.
What so and we talk about wrestling journalism. There's Dave Meltzer, there's Wade Keller. They're the big pinnacles of wrestling journalism in the regular circulation nowadays. But wrestling books are always still a big part of not just wrestling but literature now. The fusion of that too. That industry in its own right, the wrestling book sector of things. So obviously Mick Foley's book, that's a jersey in the rafters. If there's a top 5 list, almost 9 times out of 10, that's going to be the number one, because that's the one that really kickstarted wrestling books. What are some of the ones that you like, that you have enjoyed reading over the years?
Well, I especially liked Hooker by Lou Thez. Because Lou was such an icon in the business, and he bridged different generations. He first won a world championship in the late 1930s, yet was relevant enough to really follow the business up until the time of his passing in the early 2000s. And he really, he connected a lot of dots for me. I love old school, and Lou was just so good at what he did. There were, in my book, there are 2 generations of wrestling, the modern generation and Lou's generation. Lou was a master of that generation, like Ric Flair is a master of this generation. And I really, really enjoyed Lou's book. I like books on wrestling history. I love the Greg Oliver, Steve Johnson collection Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame books, the greatest tag teams, the greatest heels, the greatest heroes and icons, of which I collaborated with them on that. I love those historical looks at the business. But there are also a lot of books coming out today that are really good. I'm reading one right now, as a matter of fact, that it's a fun book. It's called Front Row Section D, and it's about a group of hardcore rabid wrestling fans who occupied Front Row Section D at the Greensboro Coliseum, which was the mecca of wrestling in the Carolinas for years. And they would regularly attend there, as well as shows all throughout the territory. And they were sort of some of the first group of fans who cheered for heels, and they would bring they would make these ingenious signs and bring them to the shows and sort of razz the baby faces and cheer on the heels. And the book is written by John Hitchcock, who was sort of the leader of the group. Bruce Mitchell, who was part of that group as well. And I'm looking at the cover, and Hitch has got a hat. He's got his 4 fingers raised on both hands in tribute to the Horsemen, and he's got a really nice sign saying, "You can tell the wrestler by looking at his blubber," referring to Dusty Rhodes in the ring. And Dusty and those guys hated Front Row Section D. They just the guys tried to get him kicked out of the building, and David Crockett was always looking for a reason to have him arrested. But they persevered, and they became as much of a part of the show as the wrestlers. I mean, they were like super celebrities who the fans would ask, are they going to be at the show tonight? They became attractions themselves.
And what's funny then is that is the precursor, the foreshadowing to what would become a big part of wrestling in the mid to late 90s. Like you saw it in WWF in that era, where the ECW contingency was raiding and starting to do we're gonna boo the faces, we're gonna cheer the heels, we're gonna cheer the best wrestling, boo the worst work rate in the world. And now what do we look at? It's now part of wrestling now, or watching Monday Night Raw, is what are they going to chant next? What's the crowd going to get into next? What are they going to...
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they were some of the first people to do it, and it's a funny book. You'd love it.
That's when it comes to your book. Now, one of the fascinating things about your book and is from Sex, Lies, and Headlocks, has to do with the fact of kind of you and Vince McMahon in this circumstance, because obviously before the book you've probably had extensive conversation with Vince McMahon, talked to him many a times, doing pieces over the years, and then this book comes out, and there's a bit of a change in the relationship, I guess, to say the least. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, you would be correct. I mean, I had done stories in the past on Vince. Certainly when the WWF started hitting its stride back in the mid-late 80s, and I had begun doing a wrestling column for the newspaper, obviously one of the few mainstream newspaper columns in the country on pro wrestling, we had to have a pretty good relationship, because they reached out to me on a lot of, doing promoting their shows when they came into town and stuff like that. So I had a pretty good relationship, but I always called it down the middle, and I think they respected me for that. Even when I did an extensive series on the steroid issue back in the early 90s and the sex scandals, I remember Linda McMahon calling me after I wrote that series, and she said, "Hey, I know you took some shots at us, but out of everything we had read, yours was the most objective, and I just want to thank you for that." So, they recognized that I was a journalist, number one, and that I pretty much called it straight down the middle. It wasn't tongue-in-cheek. It wasn't to create controversy. It was just approaching it as a journalist would. So, everything was pretty cool. And obviously, when I wrote the book, there were probably a lot of things that Vince didn't want made public.